Guys, what is going on? I know this is an impromptu podcast, but you know how we are, guys. It's just sometimes we're spur of the moment. Sometimes we just got to jump on it. All right. Sometimes you don't get a warning for these things all the time. Sometimes you just got to jump in and get to it. So, guys, today I've got the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Matt Larson. We're going to be talking about, going to answer all of your questions, guys. I've been getting my DMs have getting blown up since the launch of Combatives University. But first, let me catch up with my old friend Matt. What's going on, dude?
Not much, man. Just teaching, breathing.
Yeah. Slowly plotting world domination. That's kind of the typical things.
It's an evil plan, but
somebody has to fulfill it, right?
So. Right. Listen, for the record, I'm not the one who's putting satellites in all over the world and saying let's put a chip in everybody's brain.
Yeah, and
somebody else is doing that.
Yeah, and buying fucking the digital form of government out there, right?
That's right.
That's also that. So yeah, like Elon Musk.
Hello. Greatest villain in history. I don't know. Could be.
I think so. I mean, it's like if you wanted to start a villain story, like how much better could that be? Like an evil genius that puts chips in people's brains, and takes over digital government. Like it's pretty wild, man. So Matt, what you been up to going on? Where are you at now? For the guys who are not tracking where you've been at, people who haven't been following you, like, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and where you're at these days?
Well, I'm in the middle of my 6th year as the director of combatives at West Point. And so basically, West Point has been teaching hand-to-hand combat since 1905, roughly. Boxing and submission wrestling used to be. And when about 6 years ago, and I've had interplay with the program there for a long time because they're connected to the main part of the Army. And they used to send cadets down to me at Fort Benning to train. So I've been really familiar with what they were up to, and they knew me for a long time. So about 6 years ago, the person they had teaching there, who was basically just, teaching some jiu-jitsu to all the cadets, left for whatever reason. And so they asked me if I would take the job. And so what I've been doing is sort of slowly taking it from being just a jiu-jitsu program to A, combatives program, and then B, not just that, but imagine these are the people who are going to go out and lead the entire Army. And so it's a mechanism to get people out into the force and into the population who are going to be leaders and who will understand how combative systems work. And, so we've added a lot to it. It's not just here's the Kimura sort of stuff anymore, or here's the Kimura with when the guy's going for your handgun. It's not just that. Of course it is that, but it's also a lot more to it. Here's all the other intellectual aspects of what combatives really is, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and one of the things of all the things I talk about as far as like your influences, as far as helping me in the combatives world, I never really talked about as far as like when we first got together and like how like I didn't realize, it's like the one thing where it's like, hey, the only thing I think it was Socrates where he said like the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Like I had one of those moments, right? And I think what you're saying is really important as far as distinguishing the difference between combatives and just kind of a simple jiu-jitsu program. And I think people, they overlook the idea of when they see grappling and they kind of just like, oh yeah, that's jiu-jitsu. And they just kind of focus on that aspect. So I think that's really important. Why don't you, can you elaborate as far as like there's a delineation there?
Yeah. So there are levels to this shit, so, ogres have layers, right? It's like an onion, right? So, the first difference would be that combatives is focused on the battlefield. And so if you, I teach about how evolutionary pressures change martial arts over time. And the reason I teach that is because if we're going to create, an American martial art that's going to be enduring and stay on azimuth, meaning stay focused on what its purposes are, then the leaders of it got to understand it. And so what I mean, to elaborate a little farther, imagine Sambo, judo, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, they all come from the same root, right? They all, come from Jigoro Kano. Sambo came from, it was a guy named Oshepkov, who was the second dan in judo, was one of the main people who was formulating Sambo when it was in the Soviet Union. And of course, the Gracies learned from a judo guy named Mieta. And so why are they different? Well, they're different because martial arts evolve, and they evolve in much the same way other organisms do. And what I mean is, if you're a teacher and you don't have offspring, your line dies, right?
Yeah.
And so what do you have to do to have offspring? Well, you have to fit into your environment, and the environments can be quite different. So for example, a commercial martial art in the United States, its environment is commercial success. If you can't make money doing it, if you can't like get students in and then have them paying you and whatnot, well, then you're not going to keep producing that next generation of teachers. And so therefore your thing is going to die out, and so that's a quite different circumstance than it is someplace like in a military organization, where now what you have to do is keep it going generation upon generation within a service, or in a socialist country like France or someplace like that, where they have, in local towns, the federal government sponsors clubs, and then they hire teachers to teach whatever. So they hire judo teachers and whatnot. So those are all completely different circumstances. You garner the ability to have offspring, if you will, or students who become teachers in entirely different ways. And those are going to affect the direction that your art changes over time. So for example, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, whenever they learned from Mieta, Mieta came there, he was fighting challenge matches. That was the era when judo was spreading around the world. And so the judo people sent champions out around the world to go spread judo. And one of those guys was Mieta. And there's another example in the United States. Some of those champions came in 1905. And that was when Teddy Roosevelt was the president, right? So with Teddy Roosevelt, he hired the local professional wrestlers, or the best professional wrestlers you could find. Was a guy named Tom Jenkins, for the record. And they fought the judo guys at the White House. And so that was what the judo guys were doing, those challenge matches, right?
Yeah.
By the way, Tom Jenkins, the judo guy in that match, got hired at Annapolis. So they had judo for a few years at Annapolis. And the wrestler who fought him was Tom Jenkins. He got hired. It was the first boxing and submission wrestling coach at West Point. That's why his name is on the top of my head, because I teach it to all of our students, right? But anyway, so that's the exact thing that the Gracies encountered, right? They had Mieta come in there doing exactly that, fighting challenge matches to prove, well, that's exactly the ethic that they carried forward. That's what led eventually to the UFC, was them fighting challenge matches to prove their thing. Well, once you know that, then you understand how their marketing scheme worked. You understand why jiu-jitsu evolved to be the way it is. If you've got two people meeting in the cage or in the ring, and there's a gentleman's agreement not to bite each other's nose off, nobody's got a gun or a knife, and nobody's buddies jumping in, well, then it would make sense that ground grappling would end up being the focus, because that's how you're going to beat all these clowns that come in with, striking skills, whatnot, tackle them, get them to the ground, cook them, eventually get yourself into a position.
Yeah.
Okay? That's why jiu-jitsu is what it is, right? Now, with that being said, that's not a real fight. Like, it's kind of a real fight, but it's not the kind of fight that you find yourself in on the battlefield.
Yeah.
So understanding that evolutionary process, how it works, how decisions that you might make might change what you're doing over time, that's a key component. Okay, so that's one sort of layer, right? Like understanding.
Yeah.
That.
So Matt, before you continue, I want you to hold that thought, guys. If you're watching on Facebook, I'm going to let you guys know that I want you to join us on YouTube. Okay, I mean, that's where Facebook and all that, it's a feeder. Okay, it just feeds content. If you're really interested in combatives, we want to treat YouTube as the library. So make sure you guys join us on YouTube. About to kill the stream in about 2 minutes. So if you're not yet joining us on the YouTube channel, go ahead and check the link in the comments box here, and it's going to be up there. It's going to be my channel. If you guys just look up John Valentine Combatives on YouTube, it should come up with the live stream. Okay, but so Matt, so after So now we got the challenge matches, right? We
Yeah,
have
so that's one layer, is understanding how martial arts evolve over time, right? Like, Taekwondo came from karate, and it became basically a way to teach children in America to do discipline, and so that's its commercial niche, and that's what keeps it going forward. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu evolved first for challenge matches. That's what brought it all the way to the UFC and made it popular in America. And now it's evolving towards the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, because that's how schools get notoriety. That's how people get notoriety. And so therefore, if you want to have a big commercial school, be somebody famous, that's mostly what people do. So you kind of get the idea, right? So none of that has anything to do with winning fights on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to take away from the beauty of it, the efficacy of it, etc. It is to take away from the focus of it. And if you want to win, if you want to win tennis matches, you got to play tennis, right?
Yeah.
It's not good enough to be good at badminton. They're a slightly different thing. Well, in real fights, people have guns and knives. They have buddies. They can bite your nose off and hit you in the balls. And if you are not prepared for those things, well, then you're not actually prepared for fights. So if your school isn't teaching that stuff, if you're not thinking about it, if it's not part of what's going on in your training, well, then you're playing a really fun game that's very similar to fighting.
Yeah.
If you get what I'm saying. So we teach them that, and then there's another layer too, which is that it's an institution, right? Think about it. All the people who say, for example, cops should all train jiu-jitsu. Yeah, that's probably true, right? But they don't, and they're not going to, right?
Yeah.
And they're never going to. And the reason they're never going to is because of the cop culture, right? Cops, man, they have workman's comp. They're hourly employees. Every hour that a cop is training, they're not on patrol. And so that means that somebody in some administration has to authorize the money to pay a cop to do the training rather than being on patrol. And they have to make those budgetary decisions, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's all these sort of, cops don't even have PT tests after they originally get on the force, because the police unions have fought against that sort of thing. You imagine a guy's like 15 years on the force, and then he fails his PT test and he's going to lose his job. So obviously they're fighting against that sort of thing. So therefore, how are you going to have like the sort of training that you need to be proficient in hand-to-hand fighting mandatory? How's that going to fit into cop culture? When are they? You see what I mean? So to have an effective program, it's got to be built into the culture. It's got to fit within the existing culture, and then it's going to have an effect of changing that culture over time. So all those dynamics, those are all something that who's supposedly an expert in combatives, they need to understand those things if they're going to be effective in the role, specifically the role of like training a police force or military unit or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know if you see the comment below. It was I guess this is coming from one of the kind of the prominent figures out there, where inside every police officer is a BJJ student trying to get out, and he's saying, no.
Yeah. Hold on. Trying to get out of training. Right? You missed a word there, right? So I know it's not to say, look, we all know there's a lot of great cops who are doing a lot of great training, and in the cop schools, they're teaching good stuff these days by and large.
Yeah.
But the average cop on the beat or the average cop who's on a patrol is not training, and it's just the self-motivated ones, right? So that's the biggest thing, right? What's the difference between running a commercial martial arts school, even the best one, and training a unit? Mm-hmm. The difference is motivation.
Yep.
What percentage of the force is self-motivated? Look, I've run a bunch of commercial schools. I've had 4 or 5 of them. Every single person that walks through the door of the commercial school, they want to be there. They're paying you money to learn. So it's easy to teach them. Now, there's no unit in the world where everybody is self-motivated to learn. Doesn't exist. There's not. And look, I've been around the most high-speed units in the world.
Yeah.
They do not have 100% buy-in on hand-to-hand combat, and they do not have everybody self-motivated to do it.
Yeah.
So therefore, your system has to provide its own motivation. Has to, it has to fit in a way that makes everybody do it and motivates everybody to do it. And so that's the real expertise of a combatives instructor, like for a unit or whatnot.
Mhm.
So what we teach, these are people are going to go out and be first lieutenants. So they run a platoon program, then company commanders, eventually battalion commanders, eventually brigade commanders, eventually, division commanders, corps commanders, at some point, chief of staff of the Army. And when you're that, you're running a program for 1.2 million people spread out all over the whole world. And it's got to be organized, right?
Yeah.
So you have to understand the principles or they're going to happen, right?
Yep. That's so we got a question here too, is like what, as far as like the thoughts on the Gracie model, which offers cops scholarships. And I mean, I've talked about this before, that people join because I mean, I don't think you've ever done like, I was in the combat service support side, and you were in the combat side. So like from my purview, I noticed that people on that side, like, they joined for all kinds of reasons. Some people did it for college. A lot of people don't really join public service because they really want to be like a badass or a killer or anything like that, or even fight the enemy. Some people, like, they just need that step up in a social class. I think people don't recognize that. But what are your thoughts on that question as far as offering
Here's what I think. I think that virtually every jiu-jitsu school in the country offers free or discounted training to police officers.
Mhm.
What percentage of police officers take advantage? The self-motivated ones.
Yep.
So what percentage of police officers that? Well, I don't know, but I bet it ain't 10%. Like, it's definitely a small percentage. And if you know a little bit about the way cop world works, the Army has got its own challenges. We can talk about that as well. But imagine when you're a brand new cop,
Yep.
what's the first job you normally have? It's typically put you on patrol, right? So you're out there learning learning about those streets, right?
Yep.
So then what happens? 3 or 4 or 5 years later, you're doing well, pass the test or whatever, get promoted, become a detective of some sort, put you on, whatever, break-ins or something. And then what? What happens if you don't get promoted?
Yeah.
You stay on patrol.
Yeah.
Right. So we have our brand new guys.
Yep.
Working for our guys who can't get promoted. And where's the motivation there to like have everybody train it, right? So that's, like I said, that's the key.
Yeah.
Leaders provide purpose, direction, and motivation. Leaders provide the motivation. So that you have to do that culturally, meaning you have to have incentives so that the only way people can, be respected in their organization is to be what the organization demands of them, right? Every organization has, to get ahead, you have to do X, Y, Z, have to be X, Y, Z, right? And I'll give you an example that every soldier knows about. Look, if you're a great runner in the Army, you go a long ways, right?
Right.
I've known people in the Army who were just, dimwits who had outstanding careers because they were just super physically fit. Okay, so that's
the universal truth, right?
Right, it's true, and every soldier knows it, right?
Right?
We all know that guy who's a half-wit, but he's the guy in charge because he's fit as hell.
You
right?
stupid strong motherfucker!
That's right. That guy, man, he ends up being the division sergeant major, right? So, with that being said, okay, so why does the culture demand that?
Yeah.
Well, the culture demands that because we go on runs all the time, right?
Yeah.
So since we go on runs all the time, we are judging each other on those runs all the time. Guys are good. Everybody thinks they're great. Everybody, first, I tell this story 1,000 times, but imagine, I once had the chief of staff of the Army and the sergeant major of the Army in the gym, and I was like, okay, who's the best runner in the group? Because they had their whole entourage with them. Yeah. And it was like, oh yeah, Major Longlegs. He just won the Marine Corps Marathon. I'm like, kick ass. Yeah. Who's the best shot? Nobody had a clue. I'm like, okay, who's the best fighter? Yeah. Nobody had a clue. I'm like, okay, so what you're telling me is this organization has chosen running as more valuable than shooting and fighting. And they couldn't deny it because they knew who the best runner was because they valued it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't, they thought they valued shooting, but the fact that nobody knew who the best shot was tells you that they didn't actually value it. And the fighting is the same thing. Okay, so why do they value running? Because they run all the time together, right? Why do they not value shooting? Because when we went to the range, nobody posted the scores. Nobody knew who sucked. Nobody knew who was great. You see what I mean? And fighting, well, they weren't fighting. Because as soon as you start everybody fighting all the time, like you create a dynamic. So in the Army, the program is built around integration within physical training. So if you are expected to do some combatives like every day during PT, 3 minutes of practicing the arm locker, 1 day a week, some live ground sparring, or maybe some neck wrestling, or etc. If you're expected to do that, everybody judges each other, and pretty soon everybody knows who the badass is.
Right.
And what happens is everybody starts realizing, wow, if I get in a fight, that's the guy to have on my side.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? And so that if you don't have that sort of dynamic going, then people won't value it, right? And so that's what I mean by like it's got to fit within the cultures. Like in the Army, it fits within PT, right? Yeah. And for example, the Air Force program, you can't use that approach because the Air Force doesn't really do PT, right? So therefore, you have to have a different sort of approach to fit within that culture, right? Yeah. So, but in the Army, that works really well, and then it is over time changes the culture so that the values of the people in the force change. That's look, truth be told, right? Especially where I work at West Point, that's the main thing, right? Mm-hmm. The main thing is, like, I teach this class, but I'll run it by everybody in the conversation real quick. So imagine this: how did you get your values? How did you get the things that you value? Your deeply held ideas of right and wrong. Where do they come from? Right? So the answer is there are 3 vectors. The first vector is horizontal. I'm sorry. The first vector is vertical. Vertical is from your parents, your grandparents, etc. Right? Every day when they were like, putting you in the car, and if they left their seatbelt off, then pretty soon you didn't value seatbelts, right? Safety wasn't a thing in your head. And that parent, when their kid dies in a car wreck when they're 16 because they didn't have their safety belt on, that's because their parent taught them not to value it, right?
Right.
You see what I mean? So that's a vertical thing. It's not just that. That's just an example that you're teaching them all the time, consciously and unconsciously, by the things you do and say. You're an example all the time, right? So that's vertical. Right. Next is oblique. Oblique is from other adults in your society. That's coaches, teachers, mentors, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what we are to our students, right? Mm-hmm. We're an oblique influence on their value system. And the last one is horizontal. And that's among their peers. Okay. So imagine, why do we have children play sports? It's not because, look, nobody starts their kid out playing ball when they're a kid because they're going to need really great ball handling skills by the time they're 35, or else they're screwed.
Right.
But like, that's not why you do it, right? Yeah. Better get this kid started early, man, because if he don't know how to handle the ball by the time he's 27,
well, you never know what kind of life path he's going to choose, right?
That's right. Right. Definitely get him started on, ball handling. Anyway, so that's not why, right?
Yeah.
So then why?
Yeah.
Well, the reason why is because on a sports team, right? Are you competing or are you cooperating? And the answer is both. You're competing against the other hockey team, but you're cooperating on the rules, mm-hmm. right? And on your own team, you're cooperating to form an effective team, but you're also competing for social hierarchies, right? For social status. Okay, so that's a microcosm of adult life. Mm-hmm. Whenever we're adults, that's what we do. We form coalitions, and then we compete against other coalitions, right? That's Coke and Pepsi. You know what I mean? Like, and then there's rules. That's laws, business ethics, etc. Right? That's between the two teams. On our team, we're trying to make the most effective team we can, but we're all jockeying for position because we all want to be higher up there so we can make more money. Right. So that you learn that shit, how to work effectively at that when you were a kid, right? Mm-hmm. On those sports teams. Okay. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that you can, when you're a leader and you're looking at your organization and you're set, or a parent, right? And you're looking at your children's lives, you can set a lot of these conditions that could control what they're going to value in life by the circumstances you put them in and who you put them around.
Mhm.
Right. So for example, if you're a platoon sergeant in the Army and you're making your people do PT as part of, combatives as part of PT every day, they will value fighting ability.
Yeah.
It will just happen organically because you made that decision, right? Will change their value structure. Right. And so that's the idea. And like I said, just understanding these sort of dynamics is what's going to make you a more effective leader, more effective parent, more effective, all that stuff. If you don't realize, when you put your child to play with a bunch of other children, they're negotiating their values. You put them to play with a bunch of children who are from families that have poor values.
Yeah.
Your children's values are going to go that way. Count on it. It's just the way it works.
Yeah. I mean, I think we shouldn't, especially after what happened on the news with, Tom Brady's ex, now that divorce is running away with a jiu-jitsu instructor. So there's also that.
Okay. So for the record, I have no idea what you're talking about. So that's good. Yeah. No.
So Tom Brady's ex-wife is I think she's a Brazilian supermodel, so like that. They just got divorced, and they seen her in Costa Rica, one of the Valente brothers.
Oh, booyah. Well,
yeah, right. So so every jiu-jitsu guy right now is reminding his wife how lucky.
So just for the record, so I'm an evolutionary psychologist, right? So
yeah.
I'm the only guy in the entire field of evolutionary psychology that's not focused on boy-girl issues like that exactly. If sometimes you would like to talk about it, I'm really well read on the literature about the whole thing, right?
Oh yeah,
but that's not my area, but I know about it, right? So
we definitely got to do that one. That'll be hilarious.
Well, here, let me give you the Cliff Notes version of that, okay? Yeah. Everybody has mate value. If you let one spouse is like this and the other one's like this, they're going to split up. This one's going to upgrade. That's what happens, right? So that's right. It's going to happen, right? Count on it, man. So you let yourself get fat, lazy, you're not doing around, you're not keeping your wife happy, she's going to leave you. If she does the same thing, it's probably going to work the other way around.
Yeah. So let's talk about something else, though.
Okay.
You as so again, right? Combatives University, right? People not stop blowing me up about it, asking questions and stuff like that. I'm sure you're experiencing the same thing. So let's talk about why do you feel like there's a need for this, right? And also
so just take it in the context of what I was just saying about leadership and culture and about values and whatnot. Okay.
Right.
So I'll tell you a little bit of the story, but I want you to keep that in mind while I'm telling the story. Okay. So in the Army program, when I was designing the Army program, okay, it was originally a 4-tiered program, right? So there was levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. Mm-hmm. The level 1 was 1 week. The level 2 was 2 weeks. The level 3 was a month. The level 4 was a month long. Okay. Now that total was only 11 weeks of training.
Right.
But, and we all know, look, everybody who's an actual martial artist, knows that you can only learn so much in that amount of time. So the way I created it that's why it was 4 tiers instead of 1 school, because the idea was you'd go to level 1 and then 6 or 8 months later, you'd come back and go to level 2. And then 6 or 8 months or a year later, come back and go to level 3. And then a couple of years later, you go to level 4. And by the time you were level 4, you'd have 3-4 years minimum of training. Okay? Yeah. So that would give people time to digest the lessons and to improve their technique in the interim between the schools, right? So that was the idea. Okay, so it sort of worked. So some people it really worked like that, but some people didn't. So there's a thing called grandmaster syndrome. I'll say that's like people who want to teach but don't want to be the student. Okay, mm-hmm. So this is, you can see this in some of the other systems out there, like people who offer belts online and instruction online and whatnot, and they have like local affiliates and whatnot. You can go find in every town in America, there might be 3 or 4 schools run by some real black belt who's an actual badass. And then there's also probably one that's run by some blue belt who just doesn't want to be their student. He wants to be the teacher, right?
Right.
So with that being said, those guys in the Army, they started being like a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And at that same time, that 4-tiered system, it sort of became a de facto rank system. The problem was it's got nothing to do with fighting ability, right?
Yeah.
Like nothing. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, the difference between a guy with 1 week of training and the guy with 3 weeks of training, the fighting ability difference isn't that much. So by default, what started happening was that people were defaulting to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu belt system as a symbol of rank because at least that has the advantage of mostly not being bullshit, right? Like when somebody's a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, it doesn't really matter what school they're from. They're probably pretty decent grappler. And the same thing with a brown belt, black belt, etc. Even the blue belts, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good, except it's only like one small element of what it means to be proficient at combatives or to be a combatives instructor. Okay, so what I saw happening was that it was the combatives as a system was slowly like drifting that direction, so becoming more and more jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
And so people don't realize this, and every time I say it, everybody hates on me, but it's true. Look, if a combatives program becomes a jiu-jitsu program or an MMA program, it dies. And the reason it dies is because the leadership rightfully doesn't see that as focused on their mission. They see it as a bunch of people doing their hobby, right? Pajama wrestling or MMA fighting, cage fighting, whatever. And so then leadership loses interest, and eventually nobody's pushing anybody to go do it because it's blah, blah, blah. So that's what happens, right? That happens in the Army whenever you have we had a program for a while. Well, I'm not going to name any specific programs, but there's been several programs in a while that were really, really great, like division and larger level programs. Were really doing a great job. And then the next person who took charge was just really into jiu-jitsu or really into MMA, and it became sort of a club full of people who were hardcore, banging hard, training really hard, entered a lot of tournaments, winning them, blah, blah, blah. And the program dies.
Yeah.
So how do you
also too, like kind of to reinforce that point, where like the combatives instructors, when I went back in like, I don't know, like 2008 or something like that, they started with MMA shorts, and then like the NCO came, E7 came, was like, no, you guys need to put on U pants and all that stuff, and like,
if it doesn't look like soldiers, the leadership's going to hate it, right? So
yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So it's the same sort of lesson, right? So with that being said, the hardcore guys that started the program, and I just mean by hardcore, I don't mean that they're harder than other people. I mean that they're the original people who started the program and who helped it spread throughout the Army. All those guys were serious soldiers. You know what I mean? Like the program grew out of the Ranger Regiment, man. So it was like real soldiers. Lots of combat experience and focused on soldiering, not focused on jiu-jitsu and MMA. It's just like we spoke before about our shooting program was very similar, right? We were focused on battlefield marksmanship.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So
for guys who don't know too, Chuck Pressburg used to be one of Matt's guys back in the Ranger Regiment.
Yeah. So that's just a great example. Yeah. Chuck and I were some of the people who, after the invasion of Panama, the Ranger Regiment realized we needed to learn about modern shooting. And we were some of the guys that they sent to go learn about it. And so we, went to various places, schools and whatnot, and brought it back to the 1st Ranger Battalion. And then we started a club. It was called the Sunday Night Slaughter. And every Sunday we would get together, after church, come in together and start, practice killing people and whatnot. But and that was, it was just like a IPSC, IDPA, USPSA sort of, club, except everybody in it was a combat veteran and everybody was focused on battle. So therefore it had that slightly different azimuth than what you see in those civilian clubs, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's the same thing, the difference between like a jiu-jitsu program and a combatives program. It's a
Right.
difference in azimuth, right? Okay, so the original guys, all of us started, we've been talking about this for years, like how we would get it on track. Because all the guys involved at the beginning, man, they're all like I said, everybody's a good shot. You know, we used to always joke about the fact that they were like, you know, there's the proverbial "I would just shoot you" guy, right? Like, oh, you could outshoot me. Good luck on that, man. Because the reason I'm good at fighting is because I'm also good at shooting, and I know that these are two parts of the same thing, right?
It's like those vegans, like, oh, I'm getting all these nutrients, and you know, like, bitch, I eat vegetables too, but I also eat meat, and I
That's right, exactly right, exactly right.
Yeah.
What gave you the idea that I was not proficient at shooting, right? So
right.
It's like wishful thinking. They just hoped that we wouldn't do it. Yeah, and so everybody's, you know, fit, strong, good shot, good fighter, and also integrating the whole, right? Like you know, your listeners are probably all familiar with what you've been up to with you know, extreme close range gunfighting and you know, fighting in the entanglement with weapons and whatnot. And you know, so we were always focused on that sort of stuff because that's the shit that was happening in real fights, you know.
Yeah.
And we had constant interplay with the battlefield and whatnot. So how to influence the Army to make sure that we could differentiate between like the latest graduate of the level 3 program and a guy who is, you know, all the above, right? The guy who's an actual combatives guy.
Yeah.
And so we were also figuring out how would you do it remotely, because the Army is all over the world, right? So you got guys in Japan, or you got guys in Germany, and you got guys in, you know, Somalia, you know, wherever, and they have to be able to take part in it too. So that's why we sort of figured out what we would value and how we would test it, etc. And then that's how the system sort of was designed around. And then once we were doing it, we realized, well, like, a whole lot of us are old retired guys now. Why would we limit that just to people who were in the Army? Because the system doesn't, you know, there's no reason why it would just be soldiers, right? And in fact, the parts of the Army that are give standards for stuff, like the Army marksmanship standards and the Army PT standards and all those things, you know, they're typically not as robust as many of the civilian standards. So we were already, you know, sort of looking towards where we would get true excellence. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, how would we measure excellence? You know? And hey, what's up, David? Good to see you, man.
Hey, welcome, man. I know, yeah, Dave, we try to get you in for a bit.
Hey, good to see you too.
So we were just, David, I was just telling him about
how the technical.
All right, well, I'll just keep going, okay? You keep working on that.
Yeah.
So I was, you know, so a bunch of the old timers, we got together and we were like, okay, so we'll measure your fighting ability like this. I mean, imagine how do we all know Anderson Silva is a great fighter? How many people who are hearing this right now have sparred with Anderson Silva? Like that? A few.
Yeah.
There's probably a couple.
Yeah.
But that's not why we know he's a badass, right? We know he's a badass because we have watched him fight on video.
Yeah.
Okay, so video feedback has limitations. You know what I mean? Like, there's been lots of attempts to do belt systems through video feedback, and they mostly are like an instructor giving the techniques, and then you trying to display them back with a cooperative opponent or a training partner. Okay, so that's bullshit. And the reason it's bullshit is because being able to demonstrate techniques on a compliant opponent is nothing to do with whether or not you can pull that shit off when you're fighting somebody, right? Like, it's unrelated, right? Like, so it's like a recipe built to create paper tigers, right?
Yep.
But if I say, okay, look, you want the first belt, that's a gray belt. That means you need to be the equivalent of a blue belt grappler. Well, how can I know remotely that somebody in Montana or Japan is a blue belt level grappler? Well, they can send me videos of them tapping people or beating people in jiu-jitsu competitions because they have those all over the world. Yeah. And if a guy sends me a video of himself beating 7, you know, other blue belts in a row, I'm going to be able to say remotely, this guy is fighting at the blue belt level, right? So I'm going to be able to prove it. And so that's the same way we do that across the board, right? You can do that with strength, for example. You can video yourself like doing a deadlift.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And you can video yourself shooting, right? And also in shooting, there's a whole bunch of feedback loops, because if you have like, if you're shooting in USPSA or IDPA or something like that, you got like practice score, so we can like the post who did what on the things. And we have rank structures, handicapping systems within those things that tell us this guy is a, first class shooter or a marksman or etc. It's different for the different systems, but they all are the same idea. It's like you're being measured against your peers in those things. So when you say somebody is like this level shooter, and if you're talking about it coming from USPSA or IDPA, it's hard to bullshit that. They really shot that well.
Yeah.
That's how you know, right? So
and it's one of those, like, it's a specific task, and there's a number of implied tasks that are associated with that too.
Yeah, that's right. And all you can do from remotely is you can measure what you know to be real, right? If I see somebody who can deadlift 500 pounds, and they can bench press 315, they're a strong motherfucker, right? And if I can see somebody who, I could watch them shooting in a match, if they post themselves doing one of their strings of fire, and I can look up the match that they were in on practice score and see where they shot, what weapons they were shooting, how they related to all their peers. And I can see also that when they shot that classifier at the IDPA match, they shot a, whatever, first class or master class or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I know if I ask for enough of that stuff, they can't bullshit me on all of it. It's easy enough to double check.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So, and if I see a video of somebody and they're fighting at the, an MMA fight and they win it, and I watch the fight, I know if they're good in the same way that I know if Anderson Silva's good. And if they show me 3 or 4 videos of themselves fighting black belts in a jiu-jitsu tournament, and so now what you're getting at is how you could, like, as a guild of people, like the guild of black belts, we could say, who do we think, is worthy to be considered one of our peers?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that also explains why, like, a lot of stuff we don't take, like, just because somebody's a jiu-jitsu black belt, that doesn't mean they could fight at the black belt level. That means somebody in jiu-jitsu who was high enough ranking promoted them.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do they prove that they can fight at the black belt level? Well, fight at the black belt level. Yeah. Get it on video. Like, yeah. I'm not from Missouri, man, but you got to show me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And it's like that, just the emphasis on the credentials that are not a consequence of happenstance, like just things like that. So people, they're going for your neck too. So it's like
yesterday, I posted on Facebook. So everybody probably knows who Mike Green is, but just so everybody knows, Mike Green is an old friend of mine. And when I was back in 2006, 7, 8, that kind of time frame, when I was when we were trying to replace the Marines line system in the Special Warfare Center, Mike was one of the guys up there who was helping me replace it with modern combatives, right? So in 2007, 2008, something like that, I went up and spent 6 months up there, and actually stayed with Greg Thompson the whole time. And he and I spent 6 months, training together and talking about what we're going to do and whatnot. And then I was training up the SWIC guys, right? So as that was going down, I've known Mike was one of the guys who was involved in that from the get. So the point of my story was I was just trying to tell you how long I've known him. The other day, Mike is like one of the best shooting instructors that I've ever been around. And I've been around, most of the big name people for the last 30 years, So the farther back you go, the more of them I was around, but you get the idea, right?
Yeah.
So, I've trained with Jerry Bernhardt, Rob Latham, and a host of big name people. And so Mike is on that level, especially since he's also a special forces guy with a lot of experience. And so the reason I mention all that is he posted a video of himself shooting in an IDPA match the other day. Okay, so just imagine that. What percentage of these guys out there, whose credential is, I was a member of X unit, right? And that's why you should trust me. How many of those people do you see putting themselves on the line in competition?
A handful of them.
Yeah, few, right?
Yeah.
Few.
Yeah.
That's why I'm mentioning it, right? Because there's Mike.
Yep.
And he's about my age, right? And he's out there still doing it, showing you he's real.
Yep.
So,
and everybody, he's smooth too. Like,
he's great, right? Like he's a very, very good at it, right? And he's willing to test it, like where he could be humiliated, right? That's the point, right? And so this is kind of still talking about the belt system. In the Middle Ages, they had this idea. In fact, if you know what all the ideas about what we think chivalry was in the modern era, it's all filtered through like the 19th century ideas about how you would treat women and be a gentleman and blah, blah, blah. But that's not what it was at all in reality. What it really was, chivalry means literally the way of the mounted warrior, right? Cheval means horse, right? So it's like a horseman. It's the way of a horseman. And it means the way of the mounted warrior. And what it was a way that you could gain fame and riches. So imagine how you got wealthy in the Middle Ages. You became a badass. And somebody who had a lot of money said, I would like to have that guy on my team. and so he gave you property and said, if you'll fight for me, I will give you more property.
Land, titles.
That's right. So that's how it worked, right? And so they had, if you look at the source material on what chivalry really was, it's actually all about that. It's like, okay, so here are the layers of how you can do it. Well, you fight in local tournaments and jousts. Now that's great. You can be really good at that, but it's not quite as good as fighting in local wars. And that's great. You can really be good at that, but it's not quite as good as fighting in foreign wars. And that's great, but it's not quite as good as fighting in a crusade, right? Like, so it was a way to prove your worth as a warrior. Yeah. Right. And so that's where the phrase deeds of arms comes from. So, most of y'all probably don't know. And John and I talk about this a lot. This is where the names comes from, right? Yeah. So in the middle, in those days, imagine you had like a siege, right? So they'd be laying siege to the place for months and everybody's bored. And
for those who don't know what a siege is, that's like basically they're just people are huddled in a castle, and then they'll just like surround it. They're like, no food.
Yeah. We're not gonna let any food or water get in.
Like, right? Let the motherfucker starve. Right. Freeze or everything.
So they do that. Like it might last for months, right? Or might last a year. So meanwhile, everybody involved in it's bored, and they're all trying to make a reputation for themselves so they can be wealthy, right? Like as warriors. So they used to arrange formal deeds of arms. There's some famous ones like Battle of the 19 or whatever, where the both sides in the siege said, okay, how about 10 of your best guys versus 10 of our best guys? And everybody's like, okay, that's a great idea. And so then they would let the guys come out of the castle that was under siege. They go to a field and then let those 20 dudes fight it out, right? Just so that there could be some action and some glory to be had, right? Yeah. And those were called deeds of arms, right? So just like fighting in the joust or fighting in the wars or there were ways to prove your value as a warrior, right? So now take that to the modern era, because it's such a fantastic idea. The idea that we would be using sport as a training tool to A, make ourselves better, and B, to prove our worth to our peers and to each other is such a fabulous idea. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's kind of the point. Right.
Yeah. So, and it's like, speaking of badasses on our team, we got David Bolin just joining us a little late, but, better late than never. And, it's like David, you're like one of those guys too, as far as like back in those days, you'd be that guy, right? As far as like being an uncommon person among uncommon people, because it's, back in those days, the battle was like, you were definitely going to take some kind of loss. And I think, these days, it's like the concealed carry courses, tactical courses. A lot of people, they're kind of afraid of the force on force stuff because it's hard on you. So like Dave, why don't you tell the people a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from in this conversation and with Combatives University.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Thanks. Glad I could finally get in. Good to see you, Matt.
Good to see you,
So
brother.
I've been a student of Matt's for 20-ish years. Back did MACP level 1 and level 2 that Matt was talking about earlier before it went to basic and tactical combatives with him. And then just recently this year, I started training with John. In between there, I'm a combatives brown belt. I'm a jiu-jitsu black belt. And since retiring, have really gotten into the shooting side of things and the gunsmithing side. And so continuing to be a student and looking to move that forward. And the jiu-jitsu is really more of an avenue to combatives than really a love of jiu-jitsu. And that's really the direction that I look to go. We got so many concealed carry people running around thinking that the gun is the answer. They have no idea how to protect that gun or when to even use the gun. I think that the firearm is going to be the be-all, end-all. And most cases, there's no reason to go to your guns. If you can address the situation either verbally and then walk away or thump the guy in the head with your fist, you can do a lot less jail time. And so that's really what I'm looking for now. But you have to earn the credentials first. So I got to continue to work through the training and earn those credentials before I can start teaching. That's really where I'm coming from, John.
I'd like to point out to the audience that David has just totally downplayed.
Yeah, right.
Like what you absolutely didn't hear anything about what kind of soldier he was, all the stuff he's done in life. But let's just say that he did a lot of soldiering and comes at this with like a life of experience as well on that end, on the real world pointy side end of it. So I don't want you to get away with it, Dave. Like play yourself down like that.
Yeah. So let's get into this now, the standards, because that's like what everybody is asking about. Everyone's asking about it because I think why don't, instead of like specifically the standards, let's talk about like what it is and what it isn't. Because like I did the Gracie Combatives program before I started training with you. I was with Pedro Sauer for a little while. Back then I was a purple belt. So I think this was like 7-8 years ago or something like that. And then Gracie Combatives is a good program. I have no issues with it, but it was like one of those things I didn't want to follow the path there because I saw where it was going. It was just basically it was like, hey, you do things exactly the way we say to do it, how we say to do it. You turn your hand like this, not like this. And it was like it seemed more about franchising as opposed to actually producing real fighting ability in the instructors or the students. So why don't we talk about as far as like, those symptoms and then like what Combatives University aims to do and what it says about somebody when they go through that program.
Okay, well, let me just first say, I've known Pedro Sauer for years, and we're friends, and I have the highest respect for him, and his jiu-jitsu is freaking fantastic, right? So that's an important thing to note, right? But Bruce Lee, he used to say that he would put a mirror up, and he would say, "Look in the mirror." He'd say, "This is Jeet Kune Do," and he's I think it was Dan Inosanto who said, "Too many people after Bruce Lee died were trying to put Bruce Lee's picture on that mirror." In other words, to have Jeet Kune Do was to be just like Bruce. Okay, so that's one way to look at it, right? One way to look at the martial arts is to be able to say, this super smart guy figured out the best way to do it, and I'm going to show you to do it exactly the way you should because you should listen to him. Okay, and so that's kind of what you get out of a lot of martial arts schools, and I would say that by and large, that's that branch of the Gracie family's approach. Like, I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. This is the best way.
Yeah.
So I don't think, first off, I don't think that I'm that guy that I've figured out the best way to do everything. I think it's a whole lot better idea to be able to create a dynamic system so that everybody is experimenting. And then the role of the leadership is to keep it on azimuth. So everybody experiment in this direction. You know what I mean? So then we get a live, active, dynamic system. So I give you a sort of an example. So in the world of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, think about all the things that have changed. I don't know how long most of the people listening have been training, but you know, Halls Gracie brought back the triangle choke, you know, in the late 70s or I'm sorry, in the 80s to Brazil and choked everybody out with it because it was a new thing that nobody had seen, right?
Yeah.
So that tells you something. And whenever I started training jiu-jitsu, which was in like 1994, there was a whole lot of stuff that's going on now that hadn't been invented yet. For example, there was no half guard. There was no De La Hiva. There was none of that shit. The only things at the time, Carlson Gracie School was already starting to experiment with open guard, and that meant like double bicep spider and you know, the butterfly guard and those sort of things. But everything has, like, that you see in modern jiu-jitsu has grown out of that stuff by all the black belts in the world competing with each other within the rules and experimenting and coming up with new ways to win.
Right.
Okay. So note that the focus is winning within the rules.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And although the rules have changed slightly over time, that remains the focus. And that's there is complete, like it is innovative and evolutionary within that paradigm placed by those rules. Okay. So the good news about competition is it does that. It makes a dynamic system like that. The bad news is it pulls you off azimuth. So to illustrate the point, you know, what's the defense to the rear naked choke in folk style wrestling? Well, there isn't one, right? Because you're not allowed to choke people in folk style wrestling. And therefore, why would you learn to defend it? And wrestlers are not training to win fights. They're training to win wrestling matches. So that same dynamic, you know, it's like, what's the defense to the jab in judo? Well, judo people are training to win judo contests, not fights. So they don't need a defense to the jab. So they don't train that, right? So that dynamic is going on as we speak in jiu-jitsu. Like, because of the nature of the sport, all the innovation is going on within the rules, how to win within the rules. Okay. Not about how to be effective for combat.
Yeah.
Not that they wouldn't be effective. You know, if you had to fight Gordon Ryan, man, he'd probably just eat you up and laugh while he was doing it because he's such a dynamic, you know, athlete. But nonetheless, the direction, generally speaking, what I'm saying is true.
Yeah.
So with that being said, you know, it's the role of the leadership to be able to say, okay, here's the azimuth, innovate this direction. You know what I mean? And so therefore, like when people see, you know, it's why I can like stay here from this position and say, hey, you know, here are the guys that you should probably train with. They're going to teach you stuff that I don't even know necessarily because they are their own people with many, many years of experience and they've learned different slight lessons than me technically and whatnot. And so you're going to get a lot of different flavors and whatnot. So it's not like Matt's way, you know what I mean? And that's also why the nature of the promotion scheme. It's also why no one person can promote. Like, I can't promote somebody to black belt. And the reason I can't promote him is because that's not what the black belt means. The black belt means the guild of black belts accepts you as a peer.
Yep.
You see what I mean? So that's kind of, hopefully that, you know, that differentiates why our system works the way we're saying, win this many fights. I don't care how you win them. I don't care, right? Because if you can win them, then we're looking at something that works.
So let's bring David in real quick. You know, David, you come from a long line of doing really dangerous work, and so it's like you can see something when it's truthful and everything like that. Let's go ahead and call you an informed consumer, right? As an informed consumer, what made you make the decision to jump on board with Combatives University and as far as all the things you're already doing? I mean, you're already a black belt. You already have a serious career in soldiering, serious combat time. You've done incredibly things that like are incredibly admirable. That you could totally start a program And the most layman would never question as far as your credentials go. What made you, with all that in mind, what made you decide to come on with Combatives University?
There's very few people out there today that are actually training with resistive partners. And there's still going to be partners, and there's still going to be a certain level of a cooperative partnership. But even in jiu-jitsu, it's still cooperative partnership, because at the end of the day, I have to go to work tomorrow. My partner has to go to work tomorrow, and we don't want to break each other's arms.
Right.
This takes it another step. Simunitions or UTM or UTX rounds using either a shock knife or a stun, the stun flashlights, and it takes it to that next step of, does my De La Hiva actually work, or did I just get punched in the face 16 times and put to sleep? As a BJJ guy, I love deep half guard. I'm tall, I'm lanky. Deep half guard is my friend. In your class, I went to what I was comfortable with and I got shot. So
guns.
Right, exactly. And so now it's breaking those habits, getting away from what I'm comfortable with and going to what's going to work in a fight. Because if I'd been on the street with the family, I would have just left them in a situation where I wasn't there to protect them. And so that's really what brought me over to this side. And like I said earlier, I think there's a whole lot of people running around with firearms that are not properly prepared to protect the firearm, let alone anything else that they're doing. They're not properly prepared to protect that gun and keep somebody from taking it and either selling it on the street or using it against them.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing too, like coming up with programs and even assessing it, right? Because sometimes it's like people will say, well, the average fight looks like this, or the average person does that, or this doesn't typically happen on average. And it's like, unless you have like kind of a unique blend of skills, it's hard to really assess as far as like what's possible and then distinguishing from what's probable, right? Like people say, well, most people don't make reloads in real self-defense shootings, but it's like, yeah, but that doesn't stop people from emptying the gun. Like you see cops get into firefights all the time and they just basically shoot it until it's empty. And it was the same thing with and that was like a big problem when they what created the New York reload was guys would just shoot until it was empty. So it was like, does that mean like we shouldn't work on reloads, or you know what I mean? It's like it's hard. It's like Tom Gibbons would say, if you have 1 foot in a block of ice and 1 in a fire, on average, you're comfortable. So it's like, what do you guys say to that as far as try to delineating the average, the probable and possible, and then kind of providing an answer or giving an answer to give, so that way people are empowered with kind of like the best solutions possible for like when they get into these kind of street encounters or even an encounter on the battlefield, right?
Yeah, what I'd say is that the situation is gonna dictate the tactics and the techniques.
Yeah,
and so I had one of the higher up jiu-jitsu guys in the world one time tell me that real fights don't have time limits, right? And so I ask my students that question at the beginning of class sometimes. Just, do real fights have time limits? And of course they all say no. And then I say, yeah, but they do. And the reason they do is because fights don't happen in a tactical vacuum, right? There's always a tactical situation. And if you could break those situations down, sort of the 2 basic ones are help is on the way or help is not on the way, right? and so like imagine I'm like a member of an elite counter-terror unit. We're 200 miles behind enemy lines. I go through the door. I get mixed up with somebody. What do I got to do to win the fight? And the answer is not lose.
Yeah.
Because if I don't lose, one of you 2 guys is going to come through the door and help me out. Okay, so that's help is on the way. And we try to live our life like that as much as possible. You're a cop and you pull somebody over. Before you get out of that car, you're going to probably tell somebody, hey, I got a guy pulled over here.
Yep.
Here's his license plate. This is where I'm at, and I'm getting out of the car. So hopefully somebody's moving your direction already. So if you get in trouble, help be on the way, right? So that's what we try to do. But now imagine that same objective, except for this time I'm on the recon element. Sitting in a coffee shop across the street, I get in a fight. Now what? Yep. Well, help is not on the way. So that means even if I drop the guy dead at my feet with a Kung Fu death grip, if I don't get off the X, I'll lose because my buddies are not on the way doesn't mean his buddies aren't on the way, right? And so those circumstances are going to be telling you what you need to do, which means that you need to train across the spectrum of combat. I'll give you another good example. So once upon a time when I was young, man, it was actually at Fort Drum of all places. I went to BNOC up there. If any of you guys are old enough to know what that was, basic non-commissioned officer course, right?
Back in the day.
Yeah, I'm old, man. It's before the internet, right? So anyway, I was in this redneck bar, and I went into the bathroom, and I was minding my own business, right? So I was, just had my hands full and standing in front of the urinal, and this guy who was with me, who was like the proverbial loudmouth buddy, came in too, and he had like several guys following him in, right? And so I was still facing the urinal when the fight started behind me, and the first thing that happened was I got shoved up against the urinal, and then I fell down and scooted up underneath one of the shitter stalls, and I held onto the porcelain and then kicked my legs to keep him from dragging me out of the stall, beating the shit out of me, right? And so I ask you, what martial art teaches that? Because
obviously the bathroom.
Yeah, because my buddy got his ass whipped, and he was a good fighter. He was just standing up there trying to box with 5 guys, right? So it's 10 hands on 2, and he just got beat up like. And then when he finally went to the ground, he was in the middle of them, so they were gorilla stomping him, and nobody touched me. The only thing that happened was I was on that dirty floor. Yeah. But grab the porcelain. That's okay. So you're going to have to think through the engagement. And you're going to have to come up with the TTPs that are going to make you, win, whatever that happens to mean for that situation, right? And you're going to have to come up with it on the spot because you've got a tactical sense and you've got a well-rounded repertoire of techniques. If that makes and abilities, right? If that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah. David, what do you think?
Well, it's situations are going to dictate, TTPs anytime we go. And so the training, trying to mimic as many of those situations as we can. We start in a padded room with a padded wall and move outside onto the grass, and then maybe move into a parking lot and look at different things, because I want to do something different at 10 o'clock at night in the Wall Street or Walmart parking lot than I am at 9:30 on Sunday morning in church. It's going to be a completely different response based on the threat and the folks around me, backstop and other possible collateral damage. And so training is affording the opportunity to think through those situations and try to game plan things ahead of time, because you're never going to know what's happening. But if you've never, ever thought about it, then you're going to, more likely than not, vapor lock in the situation or go high and right. And high and right may put you in jail.
Yeah. It's interesting kind of having these conversations with people, because it's like everyone wants a silver bullet. And they just don't realize like you're going to have to be good at other things, and you're going to have to learn other skills. And I think it's like, it's part of it. I don't necessarily think all of it is lack of motivation or laziness or anything like that. I think just sometimes people are limited on time. It's like, hey, money, manning, time. That shit's always a limit. That shit's always a commodity, always a valuable resource. And everybody's always trying to look for ways to maximize those things. So what would you say that we do differently, the Combatives Guild and, or, guys like, David, who's on the come up as well, as far as making sure people kind of get the most value for their time, money, and their effort in terms of this type of training?
Well, what I'd say is, I imagine most people start training because they enjoy it, right? I mean, or I should say, most people start training because they want to learn how to be a better fighter. Same with shooting, same with fighting, etc. But then they keep training because they like it. It becomes a hobby, right? And that typically leads them into a niche. What percentage of people are training realistic shooting skills, realistic tactical skills, combat trauma medicine, and fighting skills in a realistic fashion? It's a really small group of people who are doing all of those things, because we just tend to, because we're lacking time, money, etc., focus on the things we like doing the most.
Right.
And so I would say one of the things one of the purposes of the belt system is to encourage people to get out across the board. Back to the earliest part of our conversation, we were talking about culture change, right? Okay, so that's the point, right? The point is to encourage people to train across the board. So you're a really good jiu-jitsu person. You should be shooting. You should be lifting. You should have trauma medicine skills, right? You're a really good shot. You should be learning to fight. You should be lifting. You should be, you know what I mean? Like, how many people, every time have you ever gone to like the SHOT Show or any other gun show, right? And look around.
Yeah.
And see all the people in there. It's like the home of the size 42, 5'11" pants, right? Like just half the people in that room would be better off at a fitness expo if they wanted to defend themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So that's real, right? The gun is not the magic bullet. Now, you need to be proficient with firearms, and you need to be as proficient as you can be given the amount other crap going on in your life. But it's not magic, right? And the same thing with fighting. Yeah, you're a great grappler. Wonderful. Everybody know the story of, gosh, what was his name now? It escapes me. Was the guys of the Fairtex Muay Thai.
Oh, Alex.
Yeah. So when he, if everybody knows the story, basically a car ran into his car out in front of his studio. It was inside training Muay Thai. He was mad because they took off. So he chasing down the street, and they got out of the car and shot him dead. It turns out he thought he was training for fights, but what he was actually training for was Muay Thai matches where nobody shoots you, right? So what we do is hopefully change the culture at least as much of it as we can to get people doing all of the above. I'm sorry to monopolize the time, but there's something like one of the main points that I try to get across to people is the whole concept of the warrior in the room. I know John and Dave, we both talked about this before, but being the warrior in the room means that the people around you are safer because you're there. You know what I mean? So like, imagine if you don't know anything about shooting or fighting, but you know how to put on a tourniquet. People around you are safer if you're there, right? And the more skills that you gain, the more of these type of skills that you gain, the better you are as just a person in society to have around, Now, to kind of take that on a tangent, imagine the problem we have with veteran suicide, okay? So when do veterans kill themselves? I can tell you the answer is when they lose their sense of mission. When people, the Army and the military in general, it provides a sense of mission. You're doing something, you're serving some greater good. You feel that way. What happens when you get out? I know that when I retired, I was in 22 years, and I went to Iraq like the week after I retired, right? Because who am I? What am I here for? What am I even doing? So I needed to get back in the war zone, right? So that for many people, it's like this identity crisis. Okay. So I would offer that you're the bulls of the herd. You're the ones who protect everybody else. Keep training, keep honing that edge, because you want to be the warrior in the room when something goes down. Remember that guy? I can't remember his name now, but was that church guy who came in and shot up the church, and the guy lived across the street, grabbed his rifle, chased him down, like put a stop to it.
Oh, Stephen Williford.
Yeah, and there was another one where the guy was a church defender. And he's like stood up from across the whole congregation and
Yeah, with like a 357 revolver. I think it was
and like plastered the guy with like an amazing shot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, beat that guy.
Yeah.
You know, because we desperately need that guy. Right. And you can't have enough of those people because we need them at any random spot where trouble happens. Yeah. And we don't have enough cops to be that, right? Yeah. We have enough bulls in the herd, right? We have enough people like us and everybody else out there who's on the path, you know, training the right skills, making sure that they're that warrior in the room, that everybody around them is a safer person.
Yeah. David, you got any thoughts?
Yeah, and it goes right in line with what Matt was saying about changing the culture. We're not saying that this association is the be all end all. We're saying get out and, you know, go do your CrossFit, go do your starting strength, go do your powerlifting, go do your Muay Thai, go do your Jiu-Jitsu, go do your IPSC or your USPSA, and then come back and show us the results, and we'll acknowledge you for what you've done. It's not this way or the highway. Where a lot of the organizations that are out there, it seems like they're more about money than they are about really training people. And it's, you know, hey, you're in this association now. This is how we do things. Here's your wickets. Here's your gates. Do these things, and we'll recognize you. We'll promote you. And we're almost 180 degrees out from that. It's like, you know, go do your own thing and then prove to us that you can do what you say you can do, and we will, you know, recognize you for it.
That's a great example. You know, when people say, hey, where should I train? You know, I typically say, you're going to need to train someplace near your home. I mean, when was the last time you went into a jiu-jitsu or MMA gym that was terrible?
Yeah,
they're mostly all pretty good, right? And most of the people teaching out there, they know what they're doing, or they'd be out of business. And they're mostly teaching good stuff. The only real difference that's significant in most of those gyms is the culture in the room. If you go in the room and you like the place and you get along with all the people, it's probably a good place to train, right? It's just like the local shooting club. It's probably a good place to train. Go train there. You know, keep your battle focus.
Yeah.
Right. Remember why you are training. You know, you can play the game without being caught up in the game. You know what I mean? Like, yes, enter the IDPA match, shoot the USPSA. Please do, right? But why are you doing it? Are you doing it so you can protect your family? Or are you doing it because you like the game? Because if you get focused on the game, it becomes tennis, right? Like, tennis is a wonderful game, and it's keeps you fit, and you can play it until you're in your, you know, quite old age, and many, many great things to be said about playing tennis, right? But it doesn't teach you how to defend your family.
Yeah.
So play a better game, and in that game, keep your focus where it needs to be. You find yourself doing all kind of non-tactical stuff, like changing your habits in such a way that you might be making the wrong decisions in battle. Well, you're off azimuth. You don't get back on azimuth.
Yeah. And even just as a man, as a dad, you just never know when you're going to have to come on those skills, right? I mean, or call on those skills. I mean, Pedro Sauer is kind of known for two big fights. He had the one challenge fight against Mr. Utah, who was a bodybuilder. Then he had another fight when he was way older, where some dude touched his daughter. And then you have to beat that guy's ass and, like, you know, wrist lock them into an apology.
Hold on. Some poor, unfortunate soul made the decision to touch Pedro Sauer's daughter.
What a moron. Yeah,
might have been a mistake, right?
Yeah. So it's like, you just never know. But guys, let's make sure we get the likes up, hit the subscribe button. We need that so that way we can have this. We can send the message to the algorithms, which are the audience, that, hey, you want good combatives content, that you need to get on this channel. Guys, we're coming up on an hour 20. So I think we're at that moment where we start losing that audience. So why don't we talk about, as far as like how to get in touch with you guys, so that way we definitely got to do another one, right? I mean, that's just the way it is, right? So we'll get together again, but let's talk about like how to get in touch with you guys so that way we can get some more combatives training.
So for me, it's easy enough. Go to combativeuniversity.org. That's where the main portion of the system is. You can get a hold of me on email there. My email is also mlcombatives@gmail.com. That's mlcombatives@gmail.com. And I might answer. Get a lot of emails. I'll try to. But and literally, I think I'm probably the easiest guy in the world to get a hold of. You can get a hold of John, and he'll pass on the message to me as well. And I have a Patreon account where I consolidate all the various things like this podcast as well, be access to it from there, and all the other ones I've done. And we've dabbled we've talked mostly about the Combatives University, and I know that's the latest thing, and that's what I really want to talk about the most. But there's a lot more to this message, and that is the whole psychology of combat, how that plays into our lives. And we can maybe John and I'll get together and talk more about that again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, what about you? How do we get a hold of you?
David.bowling@outlook.com. That's the only place I'm at right now, other than David Bowling on Facebook. So yeah, I'm available in New Mexico, and we can definitely talk about things if anybody wants to try to talk about things. And I plan on getting John back up here again sometime in 23 to hopefully do a 2-day course to wrap up after the 1 day that we just did last month.
Yeah, that was a good time. All right, guys. Hey, if you guys are on this channel, you know how to get a hold of me. Just look up John Valentine Combatives, and I'm pretty much the only ambiguously ethnic guy teaching some good combatives out there. So, no, there's some other good guys there. Raul Martinez, Ed's Manifesto, Ed Calderon. But you guys know how to get a hold of me, John V Actual, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care.